Welcome to West Old Stories Official, where the untamed frontier comes alive. Be sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a single dusty tale. Today's story gallops straight out of the Rocky Mountain High Country, where a giant of a man named Silas Boone ran a secluded cattle spread that few dared to visit. Silas stood 6'7" in his sock feet, with hands like cured hams and a beard thick enough to hide a sparrow. Yet his voice was as soft as creek water over river stone. The only soul who shared his remote cabin was a quiet widow named Abigail, whom he'd hired to keep the cook fire burning and the coffee strong through the bitter winters. Abigail had come to him 2 seasons prior, fleeing a past she never spoke of, and Silas asked no questions as long as her biscuits stayed golden and the stew didn't scorch. One frost-rimed evening, she set his supper plate on the rough-hewn table, turning away a little too quickly so the lantern light wouldn't fall full on her face. Silas caught the flicker of her movement and gently caught her wrist with a tenderness that seemed impossible for a man of his towering size. When he lifted the lantern and looked close, his breath stopped. There on her cheek and jaw were the unmistakable red and purple imprints of a man's fingers. The handprints were fresh, angry, and deeply bruised into her fair skin, as if someone had grabbed her with cruel and deliberate force. Abigail tried to pull away, whispering that it was nothing, but Silas could see the quiver in her chin that betrayed the lie she tried to swallow. He guided her to the chair beside the hearth and knelt before her, the floorboards groaning under his weight as he asked her calmly who had dared to lay a hand on her. The silence that followed was heavier than any snowdrift until Abigail finally broke, tears spilling as she confessed the truth of that afternoon's terror. She had ridden the buckboard into the settlement of Red Clay to trade eggs for molasses, believing it would be a quick and uneventful trip to the mercantile. Outside the store, the saloon owner, a bully named Jeb Crowley, blocked her path and insisted she join him for a drink in a way that felt more like a command. When she refused with the politeness her mother had taught her, Jeb's grin twisted into something ugly, and he snatched her face with one rough hand, squeezing hard. He hissed that a lonely widow had no business saying no to a man of his standing, and his fingers left their cruel signature deep in her cheek before he shoved her away. Several townsfolk witnessed the scene from the boardwalk, but every one of them looked at their boots or suddenly remembered an urgent errand inside. Abigail climbed onto the wagon with her dignity in tatters and drove home, trying to concoct a story about a low branch until the mountain man saw through it all. Silas listened to every word, his jaw set like a granite cliff, the vein in his temple pulsing with a fury he hadn't felt since a grizzly charged his corral. He didn't shout or strike the wall. He simply rose, pulled on his heavy duster, and slid his father's old hunting knife into his belt without a single wasted motion. Abigail begged him not to go, fearing the whole town would turn against him. But Silas cupped her unbruised cheek and promised he would only use as much force as honor demanded. He saddled his massive roan gelding, a horse that most men couldn't mount without a ladder, and rode into the gathering twilight with purpose burning in his chest. The trail to Red Clay was a serpentine ribbon of frozen mud, but Silas urged the roan onward through the dark, his thoughts as sharp as the stars overhead. By the time the gelding's hooves clattered onto the main street, the saloon was leaking yellow light and the muffled sound of a badly tuned piano. Silas dismounted and stood for a moment in the middle of the thoroughfare, a silhouette so enormous that a passing ranch hand dropped his bottle of sarsaparilla in fright. He pushed through the batwing doors of the Golden Spur Saloon, and the piano player's fingers froze mid-chord as every patron turned to face the living oak that had just entered. Jeb Crowley was holding court at the far end of the bar, a cigar clamped between his yellow teeth and a glass of whiskey raised in mock toast to his own importance. The saloon owner's laughter died when he recognized the giant and saw the quiet, lethal calm that had settled over the mountain man's features. Silas walked forward with the slow, steady rhythm of a glacier, and the crowd parted like creek water around a boulder because no one was foolish enough to block his path. Without a word, he reached out, seized Jeb by the front of his embroidered vest, and lifted him clean off the sawdust floor as if the man weighed nothing at all. Jeb's boots kicked uselessly in the air while his drink shattered on the ground, and the cigar tumbled from his lips as he sputtered threats that nobody in the room believed anymore. In a voice that rumbled like distant thunder, Silas said he had come for the coward who bruised a woman and expected the whole town to look the other way. He demanded that Jeb give a public apology to Abigail, right there on the boardwalk with every soul in red clay as witness, or face a reckoning the mountains would remember. Jeb, arrogant to the core, reached for the derringer hidden in his waistband, but Silas's huge hand clamped around his wrist and squeezed until the tiny gun clattered uselessly to the floor. The mountain man dragged the saloon owner out into the moonlit street, where a crowd had already gathered, drawn by the hush that spread faster than a prairie fire. Folks who had spent years ducking their heads when Jeb swaggered past now watched with wide eyes and held breath, hardly believing the tyrant was dangling like a sack of grain. Silas set Jeb on his feet but kept a firm grip on his collar, then spoke loudly enough that the blacksmith 3 doors down could hear every deliberate word. He told the assembled townsfolk that a good woman had been harmed in broad daylight, and not a single soul had lifted a finger, and that silence was its own kind of cruelty. He declared that, from this night forward, any man who raised a hand in anger against the innocent would answer not just to the law, but to Silas Boone himself. The statement was not a threat but a vow, and it landed on that dusty street with the weight of a sacred promise carved into stone. Jeb, trembling now, tried to mumble an apology, but Silas insisted he speak clearly so that the widow's name could be restored and his shame could be complete. With tears of humiliation streaming through the dust on his face, Jeb croaked out a confession, admitting he had grabbed Abigail and promising never to touch another soul in anger. The crowd murmured, and a few of the braver men and women began to nod, as if a spell they had lived under for years had suddenly shattered. Silas released Jeb's collar and told him to pack his belongings and be gone from Red Clay by sunrise, because the town no longer needed a man who fed on fear. Then the giant did something that surprised everyone even more. He turned his back on Jeb and walked toward his horse without another glance, his business concluded. No posse formed, no shots were fired, and the silence that followed was not the old silence of cowardice, but the deep breath of a community waking up. Word of the confrontation spread through the surrounding ranches faster than telegraph wires could have carried it, igniting conversations that lasted long past midnight. By dawn, Jeb Crowley had indeed vanished, leaving behind a half-empty saloon and a ledger full of debts he would never collect, which the town later burned in a jubilant bonfire. Silas rode back to his mountain cabin just as the first pink fingers of sunrise stretched over the peaks, his heart lighter than it had felt in many a season. Abigail was waiting on the porch, wrapped in a quilt, her eyes swollen from a sleepless night, and when she saw his silhouette against the ridgeline, she nearly collapsed with relief. He dismounted, and she ran to him without caring that her bare feet were freezing in the frost, throwing her arms around his massive torso as best she could. Silas wrapped his arms around her so gently that she felt more protected than she had ever felt behind a locked door or a drawn curtain in all her days. He told her it was over, that she would never have to flinch at the memory of Jeb's hand, and that the town had finally found the courage it had misplaced. That morning, as they sat together on the cabin steps sipping coffee, something shifted between them, a fragile, unspoken bloom that neither hurried to name. Over the following weeks, Silas noticed Abigail humming as she kneaded dough, and he found himself lingering at the table longer after supper just to hear her stories. Abigail, in turn, watched the mountain man mend harnesses by firelight and realized his strength had never once been a thing to fear, only to rely upon. One evening, as the aspens turned gold, Silas haltingly confessed that he had not ridden to Red Clay out of mere duty. He had gone, because the thought of her pain had cracked something open inside him. Abigail's cheeks flushed, and she admitted that she had started baking his favorite apple pie twice a week just to see his rare, boyish smile. They began to take evening walks down to the creek, where Silas would point out elk tracks and Abigail would name the wildflowers, their hands brushing like conspirators. The mountain man who once spoke more to his horse than to people now found himself sharing old campfire tales and listening to her laugh with a joy that echoed off the canyon walls. In town, the people of Red Clay had transformed as well. They established a town council, elected a fair-minded mayor, and vowed never again to let fear silence their decency. The blacksmith wife sent Abigail a bolt of blue calico as a token of gratitude, and the mercantile owner refused to charge her for that season's molasses because of his guilty conscience. When Silas next rode into town for supplies, he was met not with stares of alarm, but with tipped hats and offers of coffee, his quiet deed having earned him a place in every heart. He accepted the hospitality with his customary few words, but everyone understood that the giant's presence was the new bedrock upon which Red Clay had rebuilt its spirit. As autumn deepened, Silas asked Abigail to stand with him under the old pine where the meadow opened up to the sky, a place she had come to love for its stillness. With all the rough tenderness his giant hands could muster, he told her he had never thought he deserved a home full of laughter until she filled his cabin with it. Abigail placed her palm against his chest, feeling the steady beat of a heart that had chosen her protection over peace, and she whispered that she had already made her home right there. They were wed by the circuit preacher on a crisp October afternoon, with half the town riding up the mountain to witness the union of gentle strength and quiet grace. The wedding feast overflowed with venison and berry cobbler, and even the old-timers said they'd never seen a celebration so full of honest happiness. Silas danced with his bride on the cabin's wide porch while someone's fiddle sang a melody that seemed to climb straight up to the star-splashed heavens. The handprint bruises on Abigail's face had long since faded, but the memory of what Silas had done remained like a legend stamped into the territory's very soil. Mothers told their daughters about the mountain man who uprooted a tyrant without firing a shot, teaching that true strength always serves the brokenhearted. Fathers told their sons that a man's measure is taken not by the size of his fist, but by the size of the calm he carries into chaos. Jeb Crowley was never seen in those parts again, his name becoming a dusty cautionary whisper that younger cowhands used to scare one another around campfires. Silas and Abigail's ranch prospered, their cattle growing fat on mountain grass, and their cabin soon echoed with the sound of small footsteps and childish laughter. Each night, Silas would sit on the porch with his children clambering over his knees and tell them the story not of how he frightened a bully, but of how their mother's courage taught a town to stand up straight. Abigail would chide him gently, saying she was no heroine, but the twinkle in her eye confessed she had finally learned to believe in her own worth. The couple never forgot the cold evening when a handprint launched a hurricane, and they often marveled at how the darkest moment had opened the brightest door. Travelers passing through Red Clay would sometimes ask why the town seemed so unusually warm and welcoming, and the locals would simply smile and nod toward the mountain. Up on that high ridge, Silas often stood at sunset with his arm around Abigail, watching the alpenglow paint the peaks in shades of rose and gold. The valley below spread out like a patchwork promise, and the mountain man who once preferred solitude now gave thanks for the noise of a full house. Abigail's pies became legendary across 3 counties, and no barn raising or quilting bee was complete without the taste of her spiced apples. Silas, meanwhile, had become an unofficial justice of the high country, settling disputes with such fairness that even hardened wranglers accepted his word as law. The couple's eldest son grew to be nearly as tall as his father, and his first lesson was always that hands are made for lifting others, never for striking them down. One spring, a new family moved into the old Crowley saloon, turning it into a bakery where the scent of fresh bread drove out the last shadows of the past. The entire town gathered to bless the new establishment, and Silas carried a stone from his own hearth to be set into the foundation as a symbol of community strength. As the years rolled by like wagons on a long trail, the story of the Handprints became a cornerstone of local folklore, told and retold until it felt like scripture. Young couples courting in the hills would point toward the boom cabin and say that's the kind of love that can weather any storm the West can conjure. On their 20th anniversary, Silas gave Abigail a small locket engraved with a mountain and a pine, and inside he placed a tiny, faded photograph of their porch. She wore it every day, and whenever she felt the weight of it against her heart, she remembered that safety is not a place, but a person who stands for you. The giant who once walked alone had built a legacy of tenderness, and the town that had been shaken to its core now stood stronger than ever because of that tremble. Red Clay grew from a forgotten speck on the map into a thriving community that prized honor above gold, and travelers spread its reputation far and wide. Even in his later years, with silver threading his beard, Silas still sat tall in the saddle, and folks said his eyes held the same steady light they'd seen that legendary night. Abigail, her hair as white as the mountain snow, would often say that the best decision she ever made was trusting a quiet giant with bruised knuckles and a bottomless heart. Their story became a favorite around hearth fires from the Missouri breaks to the California coast, reminding listeners that courage often arrives wearing muddy boots. And if you wander the high passes on a still evening, some claim you can still hear the echo of a fiddle and the rumble of a deep, contented laugh. Now, I hope this tale kindled something sturdy in your spirit, because the Old West is full of folks who proved that doing what's right is always worth the dust and the risk. If you found yourself rooting for Silas and Abigail, tap that like button as if you're hammering the final nail into a homestead that's built to last. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that genuine strength protects, and let us know in the comments what part of the Frontier Code you hold closest. Subscribe to West Old Stories Official and saddle up for the next journey. The campfire is always lit, and a new legend is already waiting just over the ridge.